Graham Hale and his wife, Diane, had stopped counting years by holidays and started counting them by invoices. A furnace that cycled too often. A grocery total that climbed while the cart looked the same. A mailbox that always seemed to hold one more final notice than it should. They weren't broke in a dramatic way, but retirement had a quiet talent for turning steady people into people who held their breath at the wrong moments. Graham didn't want a miracle. He wanted a controlled risk that could buy breathing room and let Diane stop pretending she wasn't worried. He heard about lien auctions the way most people did now, through late-night scrolling and a neighbor's offhand comment about units full of business returns. What stuck wasn't the jackpot stories. It was the discipline. Receipts, photos, no rushing, no private meetups. So they picked a small storage yard outside Clearwater, the kind of place tucked behind warehouses where nobody went unless life got too full. Graham pulled cash, set a hard ceiling, and promised Diane he wouldn't chase bids just because pride wanted to win. Auction day was cold and gray. The crowd was mostly resellers in hoodies who knew how to spot tools from 10 feet away. Doors rolled up on damp couches and broken TVs, then dropped again with bored laughter. Graham kept his hands in his pockets until a unit near the far row opened and the mood shifted, not with excitement, but with confusion. It looked aggressively messy, like a dump run someone abandoned halfway through. Black trash bags tied tight, a broken chair, mixed plastic totes, and near the back, a tall wheeled trash bin stuffed so full the lid bowed upward. It should have screamed disposal fees. But Graham noticed the details that didn't match the mess. A moving strap, pulled tight like a professional had cinched it. A tarp corner folded neatly under itself. And on a torn cart near the floor, scrawled in thick marker, 3 words that made no sense on trash. Hold do not dump. Bidding started low and stayed cautious. Most buyers didn't want to haul garbage. Graham waited until the number stalled, lifted his card once, then forced himself to stop when it rose near his limit. Another bidder nudged past him, then suddenly dropped out like he'd remembered something urgent. The gavel fell, and Graham felt that heavy middle emotion that isn't joy or fear, just consequence becoming real. In the office, the manager took the deposit and slid the receipt across. Then he hesitated, eyes flicking toward the rows of doors. That unit's had a couple calls, he said quietly. People asking if it was definitely going to auction. He tried to shrug it off, but his voice didn't sound like gossip. He handed Graham the key and repeated the rule that mattered most. 48 hours to clear. Graham and Diane walked to their door and stopped. Fresh scuffs marked the latch plate, lighter than the older scratches like someone had tested it recently. Graham didn't open it. He photographed the unit number, the lock area, the corridor angles, the camera domes, then pocketed the key and guided Diane back toward the car. He wanted daylight, gloves, and a dolly before they touched anything. Halfway to the gate, Graham's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. No threat, no explanation, just one line that made Diane go still beside him. Don't waste time on that, Ben. Graham and Diane returned at first light with a dolly, gloves, a phone tripod, and a fresh disc lock from the office. Graham didn't mention the message yet, but he asked for a second printed receipt with timestamps and paid for a facility lock, so the unit would require 2 keys, theirs and the yard's. The manager's face tightened as he printed it. Then he added one more detail like he hated himself for speaking. Late last night, someone had come in asking which unit had the trash bin, saying it belonged to a family member who forgot to pay. The manager claimed he hadn't shared anything, but the specificity made Diane's stomach drop. Trash bin. Not furniture, not boxes, not a storage unit. Just the bin. At the door, Graham filmed the latch and the concrete line in front of it before he touched anything. In daylight, the scuffs looked newer, and a faint smear of grit sat along the bottom, seemed like something flat had tested the gap. He lifted the door only to chest height, keeping a clean exit behind him, then let the camera drink in the scene before his hands did. The unit was a performance of disorder. Trash bags stacked like bodies, a broken chair, mismatched totes half open with towels and clothes spilling out, all of it screaming dump fee. But the bin near the back stood too upright, too clean, lid bowed like it was straining to keep a secret. Even the knots on the trash bags were consistent, tied with the care of someone who didn't want them ripping during transport. They moved slow, treating it like evidence even though it wasn't, because panic makes people sloppy. Graham marked piles with painter's tape and numbers while Diane wrote timestamps. Under the first tote, they found junk that looked chosen on purpose. Cracked dishes, dead cables, cheap shoes, everything that would discourage a bidder from digging. Then Graham lifted a heavy canvas cover that wasn't tarp at all, the kind used to protect paint. And his flashlight caught a flash of deep red metal so glossy, it didn't belong in a trash-staged unit. When he pulled the cover back fully, the air changed. A full-size cruiser motorcycle sat there on its stand. Wide bars, clean tires, expensive shape, the kind of machine that makes people stare even from a distance. The shock didn't stop there. A second cover revealed a mud-caked dirt bike with dried grit packed into the tread, like it had been rushed in from somewhere it didn't belong. A third cover hit a sharp sport bike with the aggressive lines of speed and attention. And half hidden behind a trash wall was a small red moped, almost comical next to the others, positioned like bait for anyone who wanted to believe the unit was only a cheap ride in junk bags. Diane whispered the question neither of them wanted to say louder. Why would anyone hide for bikes under stage trash? Graham did the boring thing first, the thing that saves people later. He filmed the VIN areas without touching them, and what he saw made his jaw tighten. On the cruiser, the plate edges looked lifted and pressed back down. On the sport bike, the sticker was partly scratched, like someone started to erase it and quit. The dirt bike serial area was smeared with grime that looked rubbed, not earned. There were no titles, no keys, no clean story. Only a small envelope with a single loose key taped to cardboard that didn't fit any ignition. It felt less like a lucky find and more like a room someone built to delay questions. That was when the bin started to feel less like the bin and more like the real reason the unit existed. Graham lifted the lid a few inches and the smell hit first. Sour trash mixed with motor oil. Beneath the top layer sat not garbage, but tools wrapped tight. Socket sets, a cordless impact driver, bolt cutters that looked barely used, and a cracked handheld scanner. The marker on one torn carton flashed again in his mind. Hold do not dump. And he understood the message he'd gotten wasn't advice. It was instruction. They stepped into the corridor, locked up, and stood with their coffee going cold while Graham's phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Another line with the calm tone of someone who thought they were in charge. You already got lucky. Don't get greedy. Graham didn't reply. He didn't argue with air. He lowered the door, clicked both locks, and walked to the office to ask the manager for gate logs and camera coverage. Because if someone was giving him orders, it meant someone was watching. The manager didn't deny it this time. He only said, quietly, if anyone comes asking about that unit, you come straight here. They were halfway to the car when a dark shape sat beyond the fence line on the access road, parked just far enough to be nothing, positioned just right to see the lane. Graham kept walking like he hadn't noticed, but Diane's posture went stiff beside him. At the stoplight leaving the property, Graham's phone vibrated again. This time it wasn't a sentence. It was a photo attachment, taken inside their unit, framed on the bikes, with today's timestamp in the corner. Next time, we don't text. Graham didn't go home after seeing that timestamp photo. He pulled into the brightest lot he could find, saved everything to cloud storage, then called the facility manager and told him, plainly, that someone had been inside the unit after the sale. The manager didn't argue this time. He asked Graham to come back while the office was open and said he'd keep the camera footage ready. Graham and Diane returned with their folder, their receipts, and the new disc lock still unopened in its package because they'd stopped thinking in luck and started thinking in records. A sheriff's deputy arrived without drama, the way real problems do. Graham showed the messages, the photo, the fresh scuffs, and the footage timestamp the manager pulled up. In the lane, the deputy treated the door like a scene, not a story, photographed the latch, the seam, the floor, then had the manager open the facility lock and Graham open his own. The door went up only partway. The deputy's flashlight moved over the bikes and paused at the VIN areas, and his tone changed just enough to make Diane's throat tighten. He didn't accuse Graham of anything. He told him, quietly, he'd done the single smartest thing a buyer could do. Stop touching, document, and call before trying to solve it alone. Within an hour, the answer was ugly and simple. 3 bikes flagged as stolen in neighboring counties. The 4th was pending verification, which usually meant the paperwork just hadn't caught up yet. The stage trash, the stripped plates, the bolt cutters in the bin, the cracked scanner, the matching riding gear with tags still on. It all fit a pattern that didn't need imagination. Someone had been using storage units like relay points, and Graham had accidentally bought the room where they'd parked their problem. The next step wasn't heroic. It was procedural. The deputies sealed the unit, scheduled a tow recovery for the motorcycles, and told the facility to preserve every camera angle they had. He also wrote Graham a short statement confirming Graham was the lien sale purchaser who reported suspicious activity immediately. That one page mattered almost as much as the arrest later, because it kept Graham on the right side of every future question. The pressure text stopped the same day the deputy visited, like a light switched off. No more warnings about the bin. No more don't get greedy. No more photos. Just silence, which was the closest thing to relief Diane had felt all week. 2 weeks later, the facility called Graham back in. The stolen property had been removed, the unit cleared by investigators, and the manager slid a refund form across the counter for the auction price and the extra locks and extension fees they'd paid once the unit became evidence. The manager didn't apologize, but he did something better. He made it right on paper. A little later, an insurance investigator tied to one of the bikes issued a modest recovery reward, the kind of check that isn't life-changing but can change a month. Nora cried in the car when she saw the number, not because it was huge, but because it meant heat and tires without guessing. What remained in the unit after the big seizure was smaller and cleaner. Ordinary tools, unopened riding gloves, a few bins of household items that sold slowly and honestly. Graham listed them the careful way, meeting buyers only in public places, keeping receipts, refusing anyone who asked too many questions. Over the next month, those small sales stacked on top of the refund and the reward until their kitchen table stopped feeling like a place where bad news arrived. By early spring, the story had settled into something Graham could live with. The furnace bill was paid. The truck got new tires. They rebuilt a small buffer in savings. And for the first time in a long while, Diane opened the mail without bracing her shoulders. Graham never got the fantasy jackpot, but he got something more believable, a clean ending, a clear record, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when the easy path tried to turn him into someone else, he chose the boring, correct one, and it saved them. And when Graham drove past that storage road again, he didn't feel tempted. He felt grateful they'd walked away with their lives intact, and their dignity still theirs.